Hello everyone, my name is Armin, and welcome to my video series on Home Assistant. So let's get straight into it. What is Home Assistant? A Home Assistant is a smart home automation software that connects to your smart home devices such as your smart lights, smart switches, security cameras, TVs, media players, and it allows you to create a unified smart home system, if you will, that can talk to each other through automations and scripts and scenes and stuff like that. So this is meant to rival other offerings such as Samsung's SmartThings or Apple's HomeKit. But the main distinction between Home Assistant and these other offerings is that Home Assistant is open source. And basically what that means is that you can go in and see how Home Assistant is coded, and you can actually also contribute to the development of Home Assistant as well. So this comes with a few unique advantages. Number one, and perhaps the most important, is security and privacy. So because Home Assistant is open source, you can actually go in, see the source code, and make sure there's no funny business happening, there's no data tracking being done, and everything done on Home Assistant is done locally on your home network instead of some cloud server far away, right? So you can make sure that none of your data, all your data is secure and it's safe. So that's the first advantage. The second advantage is that there's a large pool of compatible devices that work with Home Assistant. And this is partly due to the fact that it's open source and that you can actually develop code for Home Assistant. So basically, if something doesn't work with it, you can actually go and write integrations that to make Home Assistant compatible with a particular device or platform. And so because of this, there's already a very large pool of compatible devices and platforms. Basically, if something connects to the internet through Wi-Fi, or if it's controlled via RF, infrared, Bluetooth, all these devices work with Home Assistant. And it's especially useful if you like to do a lot of DIY stuff with Arduinos or ESP microcontrollers. Home Assistant is great for that as well. So that's the second advantage. The third advantage is that Home Assistant has a very large community behind it. So basically, if there's something you're trying to do with Home Assistant and you can't quite figure out how to do it, chances are you can just Google it, and then someone has already done it, so you can see how they did it. And even if someone hasn't done it, there's a large community who's willing to help you out to figure out what you're trying to do, right? So this is a very big advantage in my opinion as well. So these are the three main advantages in my opinion. The big disadvantage with Home Assistant is that it is a bit harder to learn. There is a learning curve behind it. You do have to learn a little bit of coding and a little bit of logic. It's a bit harder to get set up than, say, Apple's HomeKit. And in this video series, I'll be trying to address that. I'll be trying to teach how Home Assistant really works and how you can get comfortable with the back end to develop your smart home system for yourself from the ground up. So first things first, where can we, or how do we install Home Assistant? So Home Assistant actually works on existing PCs. So if you have Windows, Linux, Mac, Home Assistant can actually install on top of those. So if you're just getting started with Home Assistant and you want to see what the hype is about, you just want to see if it works for you, I recommend just trying it out on an existing PC. If you do want to get more serious with it though, I recommend having a dedicated server for your Home Assistant. And this doesn't have to be anything fancy. So I personally use one of these Raspberry Pis. These are only about $50 or $60, and it works great. You can also, if you have an old PC lying around, you can install it on that. Now I believe Home Assistant also sells its own hardware called the Home Assistant Blue, which is only about $100. It's basically just like something similar to a Raspberry Pi with Home Assistant pre-installed on it. So you can buy that, and that also supports the Home Assistant initiative. So let's go to the computer now, and I'll talk about how you can use the documentation to install Home Assistant on your platform of choice, and then we'll talk about how we can get started with Home Assistant. So the first thing we're actually going to do is we're going to go to Google. We're going to type in Home Assistant, and we're going to familiarize ourselves with the website and the documentation. So the first thing that's of relevance is just getting started. So we're going to click on this getting started link here. And here we can see the installation instructions for different platforms. So if I click on installation, they have Raspberry Pi here, Intel NUC, Windows, Mac, Linux, and all the different platforms that you may want to install Home Assistant on. So for this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a fresh install of Home Assistant on Raspberry Pi and guide you through it. And I'm actually not going to guide you through the actual installation, since that's really not the goal of this video series. And also the installation instructions are pretty well done here. So I'm just going to do a fresh install, and I'll see you guys in a few seconds. So once you have Home Assistant installed on your Raspberry Pi or your Windows machine or whatever your platform, to access it, you're going to want to open up a browser, and in your address bar, type in Home Assistant .local:8123, which is the default port, and hit enter. And on the first time opening Home Assistant, it's going to take you to this page. So we're going to set things up. Type in our name. My name is Armin. Username also Armin. Create a password. Eventually, you're going to want to create a username for every person in your home, but for now, let's just do one user. Name of your Home Assistant installation. I'm going to type in YouTube demo. And a time zone, I'm in Toronto. Elevation, just 0 meters, and I use the metric system. And here I asked if you want to share some information with the developers for improvement. Generally, I like to do that. And lastly, before we get set up, it shows me a list of devices that it's automatically discovered on my network. So let me just add a few of these. It discovered my receiver. So let's add this area. Let's just add it in the living room for now. And let's add my bedroom lights, just so we have something to work with. With these auto-discovered integrations, it's generally pretty straightforward because it tells you exactly what you need. Okay, and that's everything for now. So let's press finish. Once you're done with the initial setup, you arrive at the Home Assistant front end, and you can see here that Home Assistant has automatically added a few entries here. So my bedroom lights, which are here as a switch, I can turn them on and off. My family room receiver, I can turn it on or off. And it's added some default sensors, such as the Raspberry Pi power sensor, which tells us if the power supply for the Raspberry Pi is okay, and the sun sensor, which tells us the position of the sun. So these are some of the defaults. As we add more integrations and more things to our Home Assistant, Home Assistant would automatically add this to our front end. That being said, we can also customize it ourselves. So if I press the 3 dots here, I can click Edit Dashboard. And on the first time, it's actually going to give me a warning. It's going to say, this dashboard is currently being maintained by Home Assistant. So are you sure you want to take control? Because if you take control, it won't automatically add integrations onto the front end. So I'm going to take control so I can demonstrate what you can do with it. And then to customize this, I can press Add Card here. Add card, and there's multiple different card options I can add. So for example, there's entities card where I can have multiple entities listed. I can have a history graph, a simple light, a media controls for a TV receiver, etc. And a whole bunch of options which you can play around with. You can also have different views in the Home Assistant front end. So if I click Add View, maybe I want all my kitchen entities in one view, so I can add kitchen here. And then I can add some cards, like just a generic bedroom card in the kitchen view. Yeah, and you can also have multiple dashboards here, which I'll get to later. The front end for Home Assistant is very expansive. There's a lot of stuff you can do with it, and really it depends. It deserves a video or a few videos on its own. So I won't get into too much depth with the front end. But beyond that, we also have a few different panels here in the sidebar. So there's a map, and I don't have location services on right now, so it's showing me in Amsterdam. But the map can, it can track different people who are within your Home Assistant installation. It can track if they're at work, if they're at home, if they're at the gym, for example. I don't have that set up yet. Then there's a logbook, which it tells us, things that have happened recently. So I turned my lights on and off a few times, so it's logged that here. There's of course not much here because it's a fresh installation. There's the history tab, which shows me the history of my different entities. So for example, if we see my lights here, right here, it shows that they were off, and then they were on for a little while, then off, then on for a little while, and so on. And finally, there's a media browser tab, which I personally don't use this feature, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But it's used for adding music, movies, videos, and pictures to your Home Assistant installation. So going beyond the initial tabs here, we also have a bunch of configuration options here. So if I start at the bottom and I click my name, this is where I have the user options for my personal user. So I can do stuff like hiding the sidebar, enable push notifications, which is not enabled on a laptop, but if this was on a phone, you could use push notifications, advanced mode, automatically close connections, some basic user options here. Within the notifications tab, this is where you see any notifications regarding configuration issues or if any integrations are misbehaving, etc. So here we have a notification that says we've discovered new devices on your network. We saw that on the initial setup and we added a few, but we can go check it out. You can see it's the same integrations that showed up on the first setup. Beyond that, there's a configuration tab here. And there's a lot of configuration options, and I'm going to make different videos talking about the different options here. For now, in this video, I'm just going to talk about the general settings. So if I click General here, this is where you can change the name of your Home Assistant installation, which we called YouTube Demo in the initial setup. We can also change time zones, URLs to access your Home Assistant, etc. At the top here, we can click Server Control. So within the Server Control menu, you can check if your configuration is valid. So a lot of configuration in Home Assistant is done via configuration files and YAML. So by checking this button, you can make sure that you don't have any syntax errors or any invalid options. You can also restart your server here, which is required every time you make a change in the configuration files. And if you don't want to restart your server, but maybe you added an automation or you added some input boolean or a certain part, you can restart that part of the configuration as well. Going beyond that, there's logs here, which it gives us logs. So right now it's saying some device didn't, or my receiver didn't respond. And lastly, there's info, which tells us the information regarding our installation. So stuff like the version number, installation type, etc. here. And all this stuff, I clicked on general here, but the tabs at the top just represented the different options here as well. Okay, so that was some general settings. Now let's talk about the supervisor tab here. So if I click on supervisor, this is where I can see any of the software add-ons I've added. And this is also where I see any updates to Home Assistant that may be available. I did a fresh installation, so there's no update right now. But going beyond that, I can also go to the add-on store. And this is where I see a list of add-ons. Now add-ons are not to be confused with integrations. Integrations are, as the name suggests, platforms or devices that integrate with your Home Assistant installation for automation purposes, whereas add-ons add software functionality. So we have stuff like SSH if you want to SSH into your Home Assistant installation. We have stuff like DuckDNS if you want to use a DNS server, a DHCP server within Home Assistant, and then there's also community add-ons. For example, a Unify controller, if you use Unify, you can have a controller running on Home Assistant, etc. So one of the add-ons I really like to use is File Editor, which I'm going to install here. And what File Editor does, or actually I'll show you what it does in a second once it's done installing. But while we waited for it to install, let's go back and talk about snapshots. So snapshots is essentially a way of backing up your Home Assistant installation, creating a snapshot at that time in case you want to recover something or you make some changes and it breaks down. You can just recover from a snapshot. So I can call this first snapshot, and I create the snapshot, and now it's available and I can restore from it. Restore selected, download snapshot, etc. And lastly, there's a system tab here. Basically shows me my CPU usage, my RAM usage, my IP address settings, and so on. So now going back to the add-on store, my File Editor add-on should be installed. Yeah, so if I go to dashboards here, I can see my add-on, and I have to click Start on the first time installing it. And I want this to start on boot, and I also want it to show up in the sidebar. And here we have the File Editor in the sidebar. And what the file editor does is if I click on it, it allows me to see the files in my Home Assistant installation that I can use for configuring Home Assistant. So if I click this button here, I see configuration.yaml file, and this is where I can add different configuration options. And I'm going to get more into the different configuration options in a future video. But within Home Assistant, this is one possible way to add or change configuration options. The other way is, of course, using the user interface. And I'll be talking about both in videos that I do next. So that was a very first introduction to Home Assistant and how to get started with it, understanding the front end and some of the basic settings, and talking about auto-discover integrations. In the next few videos in this series, I'll be talking more in depth about integrations and their IoT classes, how they work, how they interact with Home Assistant, and then also be talking about making automations, and more importantly, how to make sure your automations behave properly and the way that's intended. So make sure you go check out those videos as well.